Say hello, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me and listening, however you do it, or if you're watching us on a video on YouTube or on Facebook Live. However you're watching, however you're listening, I'm glad to have you join me. I've got an interesting show going set up for today. I had plans to talk almost exclusively about boarding schools, and I know I've talked about it before, but there's some things that I just don't think people have a good perspective on. So, and I'm going to talk about that. In fact, for those watching on my watching the video, I'm wearing my Deb Haaland "You Should Be Ashamed" T-shirt, which also says "Our Children Matter," because there's just a lot of misconceptions. Obviously, we had the governor of the state of New York come out to Seneca Territory last week and do an apology for one of the state-sponsored and state-funded residential schools. But there's still a lot of misconception, and I want to address some of that. And part of it is to put it into some historical perspective. But I also got to tell you, I got word this morning that Trump's education secretary, Linda McMahon, the wrestling lady, she's going out to Massapequa tomorrow, presumably to show her support to all those white folks who like to dress up as Indians and call themselves chiefs and wear their logos with their Plains Indian headdresses like it means something in Long Island. So she's going to go out there and basically manage the circus on the mascot debate that goes on out there. And I don't think she's going to be alone. From what I understand, the folks from Poospatuck, the Uncle Chug, and the folks from Shinnecock are going to head out there, and they're going to greet her, whatever that means. So it's going to be interesting. And look, I've got some friends who are in the area. In fact, one of the native guys that I speak to a lot, Adam Drexler, he's actually Chickasaw. He's not native from that original area, but he's native nonetheless. And he's been. I mean, there's not a whole lot of native people in that school district. He might be the only one, for all I know. But if you look at the demographics of Massapequa, it's like 92, 93% white. The rest of the demographics, basically, native people don't even show up. There's not enough native people in Massapequa to register as a full percentage point. So they really don't even show up in the demographics of Massapequa. But they're honoring us. They're honoring us with some false image and the like. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit too, and some of what the other developments are in their attempt to appeal the multiple losses that schools have had trying to stop the mascot, the statewide mascot ban. So I'll talk about that. But let me first start. One of the things I posted something. Actually, it was a meme that I produced a few years ago. I posted something on Facebook, and what I basically said was that boarding schools were legal in the United States longer than slavery. Now, I know slavery has been a thing for millennia. I mean, we understand that. But as far as what is legal in the United States basically is in its 249th year. It's from 1776 on, is when whatever was happening in the United States was under their legal purview. So when I say slavery was only legal in the United States, I mean from 1776 to 1875. So we're talking about 89 years. Well, this notion of federally funding and operating and the legalization of ripping kids from their homes and sending them to these prisons that they called schools, that existed for 159 years. That existed, and that's even debatable because some of the claim is that, okay, it started in 1819 when they first funded the Civilization Fund Act, and obviously became a bigger thing in the later 1800s. And the question is, well, so when did they end? We can argue that there are still boarding schools in place right now. They may not be of the forced, enrollment variety, but so when did residential schools actually end in the United States? Well, some say the mid 70s, some say later than that. I know in Canada the last one didn't shut down till the 1990s, 1996, I believe. But just looking at the dates, I guess the longevity of legalized slavery and the legalized kidnapping and subjecting Native children to torture, to abuse, to assimilation programs, cutting their hair, taking their names, any semblance of Native identity. Of course, this does tie back to the mascot issue because during this same period of time, this is 159 years, that Native kids were having their identities ripped from them, is when white people decided, okay, we like this idea of playing Indian, so we're gonna call our school the Chiefs, the Warriors, the Indians, the Savages, the Redskins, whatever they're gonna call themselves. So there's an irony in that white kids were being not just allowed but encouraged to adopt Native identities as a part of their school experience, even grade school experience, while Native kids were having that stomped out, ripped away from them. They even had their names changed. I mean, they had to, if you had a Native name, no, anything in the language had to go. So we're going to give you a biblical name. You're Joshua now. You're David or John. We're going to give you a good Christian name because we're not going to let you use that Native name anymore. So this is what the experience is. But I think it's important. One thing, I don't think people put these things in perspective. One of the things that I always talk about is how Native people have this unique experience with racism. And I'm not saying it's worse than what anybody else has gone through, but it's different. And, so when you think about slavery ending, for one thing, the British Empire, they abolished slavery in the 1830s, 1834. So Canada had no slavery. They were part of the British Empire. In fact, all of the British Empire abolished slavery 30 years before the United States did. 30 years. So, I mean, that's why the southern states knew the handwriting was on the wall. They knew what was happening in Europe and the other, empires, the other colonization forces of Europe. They knew that slavery was rapidly losing favor amongst the civilized populations. So that's why the United States and the South in particular, and of course South America, clung to it so hard because they knew the handwriting was on the wall. And of course, that the United States fought a war over slavery. Over 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War. A war fought primarily over the South's desire to keep slavery and the South's desire to own black men. Well, and let's be clear. Native people were enslaved too. That oftentimes is like a washed over factoid that people just don't seem to be that aware of. But it's true. And of course, we didn't make the best slaves because we knew the land too well. So we knew better how to escape slavery than somebody who was dragged from across the ocean, who had no real knowledge of, frankly, not just the land, but what the pitfalls, what the dangers were, what the animals were, all that stuff. So, and of course, we also played a big factor in what was to be called the Underground Railroad. We helped slaves escape. Many enslaved Africans came to live amongst Native peoples, and there was a lot of, I hate to use it, but what they call race mixing. There was a lot of mixing of peoples, oppressed peoples, because we were being oppressed in one way, and those who were dragged here from the African continent were oppressed in a different way. So, and of course, they were also enslaved. There was a lot of slave trade from the Caribbean islands, from South America, all this stuff. It wasn't always just a direct transatlantic slave trade, because so many black people had been kidnapped and sent to the Western Hemisphere. And then, of course, you have the breeding in captivity thing, so the chattel slavery trade that the United States really, maintained for much longer than any quote unquote civilized nation did. And of course, the irony here is the United States has always wanted to claim to be so self-righteous and so progressive in terms of freedoms and justice for all and all that stuff, while they were among the last to abolish slavery. So, but I think it's important to realize that even in Canada, when you have this, the abolition of slavery in the 1830s, Canada would have these boarding schools. So you could view the enslavement of Africans, and of course they were really concerned about people who were brought in from from the Caribbean especially. But they weren't so concerned about what they were doing with Native people. on the Canadian side, residential schools was a big thing. It wasn't as big in Canada as it was in the United States. There were like 3 times as many or more schools in the U.S. than there was on the Canadian side. But there was still 140, 150 schools on the Canadian side to a much smaller population. And they would continue to keep theirs until the 1990s. I mean, I can almost hit 1990 from here with a rock. So we aren't talking about that long ago here, folks. So when I bring up the fact that this level of racism and policy that could legalize the imprisonment of children and the abuse of those children, the deaths of, not one person was ever convicted of killing a child in a boarding school on the U.S. or the Canadian side. Never. I mean, the church covered them up because the church was usually employed, contracted to run these schools while the United States and Canada funded them, or you had states funding them. So the churches were implicated in all this stuff, and not just the Catholic Church, other churches as well, or denominations were involved. But I think putting this in perspective, it matters. And like, I had some pushback, even from a Native person. Well, how dare you be disingenuous about how long slavery existed? Look, I know that slavery existed for longer than the United States' existence. I know it predates that. But the country that I'm trying to hold accountable, or countries, are the U.S. and Canada. So regardless of when Portugal began its slave trade through the foundational papal bulls of the 1550s or 1450s or whatever else, regardless of that, I'm talking about trying to hold the United States accountable, because that's who we're dealing with now. That's who we're dealing with now. So I think it's important that people understand the longevity and how long this atrocity was allowed to continue. I mean, we're talking about, like I said, in the 20th century. I mean, I was still in school when the United States ended its final residential schools. I wasn't in one of those. I was in a regular public school. But I'm old enough to remember the 1970s, and I sure as hell remember the 1990s. So when I hear this stuff, we can't pretend that this is ancient history. We just cannot pretend this is ancient history. We have to understand that what the United States and Canada were doing, they were viewing Native people in a much more subjugated and dominated view than they did anybody else, including the formerly enslaved. And I'm not begrudging black people for getting their freedom. by no means. I'm not begrudging that at all. And I'm not trying to compare residential schools in terms of an atrocity or the genocide they represented to the atrocities that slavery represented. I'm not comparing. This isn't the oppression Olympics, as they say. I'm just talking about years that these things could exist. I mean, let's think about it. Not only does slavery become abolished first in Canada and then in the United States, then the 14th Amendment comes, the Equal Protection Clause, and the formerly enslaved their citizenship is confirmed, and birthright citizenship is confirmed, and then you move along and you have women's suffrage that's going on in the same in some of the same time periods. So women are advancing their rights. Again, the formerly enslaved are advancing their rights. You have an entire war fought over this, which took the lives of over 500,000 Americans. All of this stuff happens, and Native people are still being treated exactly the same. You have movement in terms of understanding racism. You have Brown versus the Board of Education. You have the Civil Rights Movement. You have all of these so-called actions to promote progressiveness and civil rights and human rights. And you've got the United States claiming to be a champion of it all. They're dropping atomic bombs on places like Japan, and they're saving Europe against the Germans and ultimately against the Nazis. But so they're claiming all of this self-righteousness, all while they're still taking a people who are not U.S. citizens, that they've cast us as wards of the federal government, and they're grabbing our children. They're taking our children. And they're not just taking them physically. They are taking them mentally. They're changing their names. Many of these kids never had families to go back to for a variety of reasons. We experienced the longest period of land loss during this period of time, too. So when I think about talking about this stuff. I don't need an apology. I don't need one from Deb Haaland. I don't need one from Joe Biden. I sure as hell don't need one from, from Kathy Hochul. And in fact, the reason I say Deb Haaland you should be ashamed is because her Interior Department, in the 11th hour of their service as she was elevated to this Secretary of the Interior, they produced a report and they lowballed every single number including the number of kids that they confirmed died in these schools. They said, well, we know at least 1,000 children died in these schools. Hell, that many died probably just in Carlisle Indian School, which only operated for 30 years. To suggest that at least 1,000, for one thing, if you know it's more than that, then don't even throw the number out there. I mean, if you can't come up with a real number, one that is believable, don't say something like at least 1,000. Say, well, I covered myself because I said at least. I said at least. So, it could have been 10,000, but at least when I said at least 1,000, I wasn't wrong. Yeah, you were wrong. You were disingenuous and you were misrepresenting the level of atrocity that took place in these schools. I mean, because we didn't just talk about children who were murdered, and there were children murdered, including infants that were thrown into incinerators. Yeah, that's what the Sugar Cane, the film about Canadian school or a residential school on the Canadian side was about. But yeah, there was that. But there was also mistreatment. There was neglect. There was starvation. There was inadequate health care. They knew that certain illnesses that ravaged other parts of society required quarantine. Do you think Native kids were quarantined? No. Native kids, at some points in both the U.S. and Canada, the death rate, the mortality rate for a student in a boarding school was over 50%. So you had a 50% chance of dying if you were in those schools. I mean, that's absurd. And of course, we're talking about a variety of diseases, not just, basic diseases like influenza. Smallpox was still an issue. Obviously some of the other communicable diseases like, polio and, scarlet fever and, typhoid and, the Spanish flu. All of these diseases, tuberculosis, all of these things were allowed to spread because they didn't quarantine them. In fact, they had kids sleeping together. So this contributed to the mortality rate of children in these schools. And at some point, you can't say that it was accidental. If you knew that quarantining is what you did to any other people in the country or countries, but you didn't do it to Native kids? Because here's the thing. When you have churches that are running these things, you got this sounds absurd, but let me just say it. The point of a church is to save souls, not bodies. I think about some of the quotes that I heard from Junipero Serra, who was this Spanish missionary and was made a saint by the last pope. He used to count the number of kids that he baptized as the kids that he saved. It didn't matter that they weren't going to live past 7, because baptism was about saving souls. So in these schools, it didn't matter if the children died. I mean, the policy was kill the Indian, save the man. And this is a John Kane original quote. So when I say kill the Indian, save the man, wasn't just a metaphor, because metaphors don't require graveyards. That's just a matter of fact. You can't say our policy is kill the Indian, save the man, and then pretend the death rate. The fact that your schools require graveyards is indication enough. So you knew that children were dying in your schools, and it wasn't by accident. And not only did you kill kids and abuse children, you also prevented more. What do you mean you prevented more? You did surgery on the girls. You sterilized, especially the full-blooded native girls. You made it so they would never have children. That's one of the things that qualifies it as genocide. Look, genocide, again, the 5 acts, the 5 categories that any one of them represents genocide was the causing of death with the intent to destroy a people, the physical harm or mental harm, the injury that you that you induce on these on a people, not just children. This just all just happens to be children, but committing psychological, sexual, physical harm against against the people with the intent to destroy them, or creating the conditions. This is the one they sometimes call cultural genocide. Creating the conditions that will cause the destruction of a people, and that means wiping out their culture. That means forbidding their language, changing the names, stripping away any identity, native identity from these kids. Again, in the back of my, I can't even say that without thinking about white kids playing Indian in their schools. But anyway, I'll get back to that. So that's the third category that, again, all by itself. Again, keep in mind, I always said with the intent to destroy a people, because intent is what makes these crimes, and they're all crimes all by themselves, but what makes these genocide is with the intent to destroy people. So you've got the death, the injury, creating the conditions, and then there's preventing births, sterilization, rendering these girls barren for the rest of their life. Of course, and that was through surgery, but there were an awful lot of women who would never have children anyway, just because of the sexual abuse that they experienced. So you had a way of preventing birth by doing the psychological harm, not just the surgery and the physical harm. So I just got to put that out there. And of course, the fifth category is just what the schools were all about: taking children from native homes and putting them in the care of white folks, Christians, churches, priests, nuns. Those five things all by themselves, any one of them by itself, it constitutes genocide. And the residential schools ran all five of those actions against Native kids. It's almost like, define genocide for me, because I'm going to build a whole program around committing genocide to children, on children. And that's what the United States and Canada did. And they did it for a long, long time. This is not generations before my time. This is my generation. I know people who either are the children of survivors of these schools, and I know some people who actually are the survivors of some of these schools. And if you don't call somebody who went to a school an alumnus, if you call them a survivor, yeah, that's another pretty good indication of what those schools were about. So when Deb Haaland and Ryan Newland put this report together and lowballed all the numbers and whitewashed all the numbers, and then never even attempted to make a recommendation to research and find out how many children died. That's not even in her recommendation. Her recommendation starts with a formal apology. So what does Joe Biden do? He goes down to Arizona, swing state, 10 days before the election to try to garner some votes by apologizing in a state with a fairly sizable Native population, thinking he was going to win over liberals and he was going to win over Native people. A political stunt. So that was the only box that got checked. Out of Deb Haaland's recommendations, one box got checked, and that was politically motivated. I mean, it's sickening at a whole another level. But she also decided that they needed to come up with a dollar value to assign this crime. You think about if a chemical company did something that caused deaths, you would go through this really detailed process to figure out, well, how much harm was really done? How many people were hurt? What was the cost? And how do you assess a value to the harm that was committed against the victims of this crime or this bad chemical or this bad drug or whatever else? And that's what it happens all the time. If there's an accident that was preventable, a train wreck, use Palestine, you think about something like that. Yeah, somebody's got to be held accountable. An oil leak, whether it's offshore or whether it's a train wreck or whatever else, there has to be a way to hold those responsible for the damages accountable. But that's not what they do with residential schools. No, what Deb Haaland and Ryan Newland did was to say, how much did we spend in the commission of this genocide? So they did a calculation based on the dollars appropriated through Congress. Then they adjusted it for inflation, and they said, all right, we come up with a number. We got a number of $23.3 billion. That's how much the United States, and that's a pretty staggering number, for most people to even hear. Billion with a B. $23.3 billion the United States spent in the commission of genocide through our children. But that's not the level of damages. That's how much you paid to do it. That's like asking somebody who robbed a bank, how much did it cost you to rob the bank? And what, you're going to assess that as part of the punitive damages against that criminal? No, you figure out how much they stole. You figure out how many people were injured, how many people were killed, and then you assign. I don't know how you assign a value for loss of life. I don't know how you do that. Canada did it. They wrote checks after their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a joke. So that's what Deb Howell and Brian Newland did, was to say, we're going to calculate the cost of committing this crime, not place any value on the damages that was done. And I really think it's important that you understand what I'm saying here. There's a difference between the cost of the commission of a crime and the value of the harm, or the assigned value, or assessing the damages done by the crime. They didn't do this. They only figured out how much the United States paid to do this. And then they said there should be an equivalent amount spent to make this right. No, there shouldn't. That number should not be in the equation. I think it may have some value in knowing that the United States spent that much money to commit this genocide against Native people. But that's not what gets you off the hook. You don't spend that much money now and say, all right, now we're even. No. We want our land back. We want our recognition back. We want our autonomy back. We want restoration, not checks. And then you were going to write checks anyway. You're going to do programs. Among the recommendations was, well, we think we should compare our notes with the rest of the world to find out how other nations of the world treated indigenous peoples. And you're going to assign that a monetary value? You're going to do that kind of study? Or you want to study the current effects of what you did for that 150 years? You're not going to assess the damage that you did during that 150 years. What Deb Howland was recommending was we need to determine what are the impacts today of what we did. Well, what about the impacts of what you did while you were doing it? So, look, this is what I was going to talk about this for the full hour. I'm not going to do that now, because I do have to talk about what's happening out in Massapequa tomorrow. So we're at the bottom of the hour. Let me just say, we are listener-supported radio. We count on your contributions to both WBAI and WPFW. Solely. I mean, almost solely. We don't have corporate underwriting. We don't have, the government funding coming into these stations. We have listeners like you who hear the stuff. And look, I know some of what I talk about is kind of hard to hear. I mean, it's not hard to hear because I'm not loud enough. It's hard to hear because it's painful. Truth is uncomfortable. It is. It's uncomfortable, and I get it. And some of the things I talk about are painful to hear. And I'm not doing it to, look, I'm not trying to make white people feel guilty. I'm trying to get some accountability here. And I know that we cannot hold anybody accountable, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. We can't hold anybody accountable if I don't have some of the support of people like you who listen to this station or these stations. So that's why I do what I do here on these stations. I realize that I'm not broadcasting to a native population necessarily. I'm broadcasting to people who live in Washington, D.C. and New York City. And anywhere else people pick up the show. And I need you people to support the radio stations that carry this show. So again, if you are in New York City, if you are listening on WBAI, I ask, and I stop short of begging, but I ask that you make a contribution to WBAI by going to WBAI Buddy, buddy.wbai.org. That's buddy.wbai.org, and make a contribution. You can become a BAI buddy. You can become a buddy to the program, to the station, by making a monthly commitment. Letting your credit card or your checking account be charged on a monthly basis. It's kind of like a streaming service. And there you can do, if you do $10 a month, we log that in as a $120 donation. And so it matters. And look, we kind of set goals for shows, but they aren't a goal that if we don't make, we're going to get cut. At least nobody's told me that yet. But I do ask. I mean, there was a time, again, I mentioned it to Reggie, backed me up on this a couple of weeks ago. I used to have more buddies than any other 1 hour show on WBAI. And
That is true.
I'm not trying to have the most at this point. I'm just trying to have some. So I ask you, become a buddy to Resistance Radio on WBAI by going to buddy.wbai.org, or you can use the telephone, and you can call 1-833-WBAI-NYC, or that's 1-833-922-4692, and give your information there. And look, you can do a one-time donation. You can do a time donation. If you can call now and say, well, I'm going to make this contribution in 2 weeks from now. So do it however is comfortable for you. And that's what I'm asking you if you're listening on WBAI in New York City. Now, if you're listening in Washington, D.C. on WPFW, again, I'm asking you the same thing. I'm asking you to go to their website, which is WPFWFM.org. And it's the same thing. We don't call them buddies out in WPFW, but I'm asking you to be a buddy anyway. I'm asking you to be a sustaining member of the station in the name of Resistance Radio. That's what I'm asking of you. So I ask you to go to the website. That's, again, WPFWFM.org. Follow the prompts. Again, you do one-time donations. You can do a time donation. You can go online or make the phone call as often as you want. And if you're already a sustaining member, maybe up at $5. Maybe you're doing $10 a month, and you can swing putting that up to $15. Whatever you can do, I would greatly appreciate it. You can also call, and the number for WPFW is 202-588-9739. That's 202-588-9739. Or you can use the 800 number, which is 1-800-222-9739. That's 1-800-222-9739. That's what I ask of you. I mean, that's my ask in the midst of what I'm giving. And what I'm giving you is probably a perspective you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to get it even on other native programs. You're not going to get this perspective. And you're certainly not going to get some of what I'm going to talk about next. And so let me go ahead and segue. I got a call this morning and of course this show airs live in New York City on Thursdays and then is rebroadcast on Fridays. So I got the call Thursday morning. So from one of the representatives of NYSED, who I speak to on a fairly regular basis, that he told me that Linda McMahon, the education secretary for Donald Trump, the completely unqualified secretary of education for Donald Trump, the wrestling lady, the one who ran the wrestling, WWF, or I don't know what they call it, but anyway, the fake wrestling that's on television anyway. That's what she was in charge of. And apparently that qualified her to be education secretary. So she's going to Massapequa tomorrow. So why would the education secretary be going to Massapequa? Well, it's because Massapequa, some of the folks out there, lobbied Trump to support their fight to keep their native mascot. Now, in case you're wondering, Massapequa is all white people, okay? And when I say all white people, it's not entirely true because there's probably a few black people in there. It's basically all non-native people. The only one person I know, and look, there may be more than one, is my friend Adam, who lives there, who I speak to on a regular basis. He's joined in the fight. He's been outspoken. He's given a bunch of interviews. He's the only native guy in the school district that I'm aware of, and he stepped up. There may be others, but he's the only one that I know who has entered the fray. Everybody else is not native. I mean, the native population, like I said earlier, in Massapequa is so small, it doesn't register in their demographics charts. It doesn't even register. It's like 99.9% non-native, 92% white, 99.9% non-native. And their mascot, they call themselves the Chiefs. Now, the town is called Massapequa. And as you might suspect, that has some native origins to it. It's probably something really bastardized. Probably doesn't sound anything like the original language. Don't know for sure. But There are no native people. All those people who gave that place that name originally, if they actually gave that place that name, are gone. They were massacred. The survivors of the massacre were paid off to leave. And they said, oh, yeah, we bought it fair and square. Well, if you killed like 3/4 or 4/5 of their population, and then you said you bought it from the ones you let live? Yeah. So anyway, that's what the white folks say, right? So Native people are all been run out of there, but they call themselves the chiefs. Now, they try to say that they call themselves the chiefs because of the one guy that they paid for the property, which is probably not even true. I mean, and he may not even been the guy who had any authority to take money for the property, but regardless. But their logo is a Plains Indian headdress logo. That's what they use. Stereotypical Hollywood stuff, has nothing to do with what a native person from the area would have looked like. So when I hear anybody say, well, you're taking away our native culture. No, you didn't have any. Even your logo is a misrepresentation. So Linda McMahon is heading out to Massapequa, presumably to show support for these white folks to play Indian. That's what she's going out there for. That's what Trump is sending her out there. Now, they've already tried to do, the education department and others filed suit. They tried to, or they didn't file suit, I'm sorry. They filed a complaint about civil rights violation. And NYSED, the New York State Education Department, responded to that complaint. And keep in mind, part of their complaint was based on a violation of their civil rights. The first response that NYSED gave in this complaint was, well, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in 2001, under George W. Bush, issued a report that basically says these things should go away. So this was a federal commission under a Republican president that was telling the world these native mascots are wrong and they should go. And that what they literally said was that team names and imagery of native people, native team names and imagery should not be allowed to be used by schools' sports teams. That's what the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights determined in 2001. Now, the Education Commission Department of New York State, headed up by Richard Mills under George W. Pataki, again, another Republican. And I say this only because people try to make this a left-right issue instead of a right-wrong issue. Republican governor, Republican president. I'm not saying they dictated the policies of these agencies, but it's just important to know who was in charge, right? So Richard Mills, basically, on the heels of this report from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, told schools to get rid of them and to do it at a time that's practical. Phase them out. I'm not trying to put a financial burden on you, but it's time for them to go. Stop using it. Stop, printing, T-shirts. Stop, producing your uniforms and your banners and your logos and your murals. Stop doing it. Take it off your signs, but do it at a time that's practical. Do it at a time that's not going to hurt you financially. That was in 2001. He didn't mean 20 years. He didn't mean 23 years. He meant phase it out in the normal course of attrition on these kinds of things. Most schools did, but many didn't. And some not only didn't phase them out, some of them doubled down, like Massapequa. So when you start paying to bring artificial turf into your football stadium, not fields, I'm used to going to a school where we had football fields, not football stadiums, but that's a whole other issue. But your artificial turf now has the logo in there. So you paid extra to get your logo, your Chiefs logo on your, in the center of your field. You got it painted on your basketball court. You've got it hang on your banners and your signs and everything else. And that's what, schools like Massapequa has done. They claim it'll cost them somewhere around $500,000 to clear out all of these mascot images on their school property. Well, I got to tell you, if you spend $500,000 putting them there, somebody should be investigating misappropriation of school dollars and taxpayer money, it seems to me. So anyway, Massapequa, first they filed a lawsuit. They tried to sue the Department of Education and lost badly. And then they appealed to Trump, and then the Trump administration, with Linda McMahon in tow, decided they were going to file a civil rights complaint, and it's really pretty pathetic. But Trump is still, he's posed for the pictures with the sweatshirts and the logos, and now he's got Linda McMahon heading out there. And I got to tell you, my friends down in that area, who, when asked by Massapequa and other schools, well, Shinnecock, how do you feel about this? Puspatuk, Uncle Chuck, how do you feel about it? They all said, no, we don't support the use of native mascots. So the native people who lived there in Long Island said no. So these guys said, well, we're going to find our own Indians then. So they searched out and they found this group called NAGA, the Native American Guardians Association. They're a bunch of frauds. Most of them are just absolutely frauds. They're not considered real natives. Some of them, it's kind of like, well, my grandma told me I was Chiricahua Apache, or that she was. And so that's what I'm claiming for my identity today. Now, some of them are native, and I'm not saying that none of them have native ancestry, but the vast majority of them are not. And it's clear that they are not. They cannot produce any documentation that would legitimately prove that they are native people. They can't produce any of it. So they're frauds. They've tried to enter into many of these debates. In Colorado, they tried to bring suit against the state for their ban and lost. They tried to step up here when I was fighting the Lancaster School District out here in Western New York, and Lancaster voted unanimously to get rid of it. So in every battle that they've entered into, they've lost and lost badly. And they've been involved in this battle in New York State from sticking up for the school that I was originally fighting, Cambridge Central School. They were there and lost. They lost at every level in the state, and now they're trying to do the civil rights thing. And here's what they've done now. This is a new one. Never heard this one before. They've entered into a contract with the Massapequa School District. I don't know what the contract actually involves. I mean, they use this expression. They say, well, we need to educate, not eradicate. Of course, let's be clear. Using native mascots is erasure, especially if you're using false imagery like Massapequa is. A Plains Indian headdress on your logo. I mean, that's like erasing what the native people actually look like who were there. So when they say educate, don't eradicate, they have no skill sets to provide curriculum. They don't know anything about the native history in Long Island or anyplace else. Most of them don't know a damn thing. So they contracted, and what they did was they stipulated in the contract that they would only do this contract with Massapequa if they kept their logo. So now Massapequa is saying, well, sorry, Department of Education, we can't comply with your ban because we'd be in breach of our contract, which is a ridiculously stupid argument. Now they filed an amendment to their original appeal, because they lost in court, right? The court hasn't ruled, but for the most part, when you appeal a ruling, you're bound by the ruling. You got to find flaws in what the ruling was. You're not really allowed to remit and produce and enter new evidence into a case. That's usually not the grounds for an appeal. Now, they're asking for an amendment, so they want to be able to introduce new evidence, including this ridiculous contract that they claim that they are bound to. Now, the other thing was the Native American Guardians Association, which tried to step up at some level as part of being a plaintiff, I guess. They were thrown out altogether because they didn't have standing to even bring this thing. So now maybe because they have a contract, they believe that they can now suggest they have some sort of standing, because they aren't native people in the first place, and they certainly aren't native from the school district. Look, when Cambridge wanted to raise their issue because the school board out there had retired the mascot and then brought it back, only people in the school district could file a petition with the Department of Education. And they had to file it based on being not just residents, but having children in the school district. So there were a lot of rules on who could actually file such a thing, and that's just at the state level with a hearing with the education department. You're trying to do this in federal court, there's a lot of rules, and they don't have any kind of adequate legal representation that's going to get them very far here. And the fact is that they are spending money regardless. They're trying to do fundraising and all this other stuff because they're spending money. And they're spending all this money while still complaining that part of the reason they got to fight this is because they can't afford to remove the mascots in the first place. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Now, one of the other things that they're trying to file in this both the civil rights complaint and in their case, their amended appeal, is that somehow Native people are being discriminated against. I don't know what Native people they're talking about. They're not talking about my buddy Adam who lives in the district. They aren't talking about the Shinnecock or the Poospatuck or the Unkachugs. And they can't be talking about those morons from the Guardians Association because most of those guys aren't even Native. So they're trying to say that we are being discriminated against by not being allowed to be used for mascots. Now, I got two things to say about that. One is I'm Native, and I served on the Indigenous Mascot Advisory Council, along with Native people, including guys from Shinnecock and from Poospatuck, and people throughout the state. We actually had an exception clause that said if you had a Native mascot and you had some relationship with Native peoples in your area, and a federally recognized or state recognized tribe, I hate to use that word, but I've got to, if they give you permission to use it, then that's the exception. Now, there's only one exception, really, and that's the Seneca Nation gave the city of Salamanca, which is located on Seneca land, permission to continue to use the name Warriors. It's not permanent permission, but it's permission nonetheless. Not crazy about what they did. The only other case was in Messina, up in Mohawk territory, where a school used to be called the Red Raiders years ago. And when the Commissioner of Education in 2001 told them they had to get rid of it, they dropped the word red from the name and they switched their logo to a knight or something like that, I guess. I don't know. So Messina asked the St. Regis Tribal Council if they could maintain calling themselves the Raiders with no reference to Native people. Now, for the most part, the rules that we put in place said if you ever used a name with a Native reference, it had to go. These guys petitioned the St. Regis Tribal Council, and I'm not saying the Native people, the Mohawks up in Akwesasne agreed with this, but the St. Regis Tribal Council gave Messina permission to keep using Raiders with no Native connotation associated, imagery, or anything else. So those are the only two exceptions. But so the fact is that these guys are trying to claim that Native people are being persecuted, which is absurd because they're all white folks. So it's going to be interesting. Linda McMahon is supposed to be heading out to Massapequa tomorrow at 10:30. I know a lot of news coverage is probably going to be there now. It's turned into a bit of a circus. I've been going back and forth with Lance Gumbs from Shinnecock and Harry Wallace from Poospatuck, and they're going to send people out. I don't know, look, they're going to have people go out there to speak up and confront this issue. I don't know what it's going to look like. I'm not calling it a protest. I'm not calling it a rally. I'm saying there's a public event that's going to take place in Massapequa where the education secretary never bothered to consult with the New York State Department of Education, went straight to a school that's trying to thumb its nose at the statewide ban. Never consulting, never talked to Dr. Betty Rosa, Commissioner of Education, never talked to anybody from NICED, never talked to anybody, but went directly, in a direct response to a plea from some of these guys in Massapequa to come out there and stand by their side. It's a joke. It's pathetic. I don't think this so-called contract thing is going to have any weight. I don't think Linda McMahon is going to make any difference. This ban has withstood state and federal challenges in court or court challenges. I don't think the civil rights complaint is going to have any merit to it because the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights told schools to get rid of these things across the country, not just in New York State. So the whole thing is a bit of a joke, but it just kind of goes to the belligerence, and I'm sorry, of these white folks. I mean, I know that I have non-native allies. I have plenty of white folks who listen to the show, who support much of what I do and the fights that I've engaged in, including this one. But when you get into some of these right-wing communities, even in New York State, you're going to get some of the worst to show up from some of these people. And that's what we see. And anytime I engage these people, invariably, it takes me about 2 or 3 engagements in social media to where they say something really stupid, insulting, and racist. I get called a liar. Or someone called me a charlatan. I never produced any false information in any of my exchange with this person or anybody else, including my work on the advisory council, including my work to get Cambridge to change its mascot, including my work to change the mascot in Lancaster, New York, and in other places around the country. I've been doing this for a number of years. It's not my sole purpose, but what I have to say, the thing about the mascot issue is that it's emblematic. It's emblematic of the unique racism that Native people experience. And you really get to come face to face with it, because the people who hate us for taking their Native mascot away from them literally think that they have this white privilege that entitles them to take our identity and use it for their amusement and entertainment. It's not even the kids. It's alumni. It's guys that are 50, 60, 70 years old who make the most noise. And if a school board tries to do the right thing, they experience the backlash immediately. They try to get them voted out. That's the reason that I chose to use the Department of Education to get this ban through. Because you know what? I don't expect any endorsement from Kathy Hochul or any support in this. I don't even think she's going to step up. She hasn't said a word. And this thing's been in place for over 2 years. Kathy Hochul's never once weighed in. So anybody who says, "Well, that's because Governor Hochul is taking shots at schools," no, she had nothing to do with this. She had nothing to do with it thus far, and nobody expects her to have anything to do with it going forward. Why? Because just like any other politician, she's so concerned about pandering for votes. She would not want to disenfranchise anybody in Long Island. Not like any of those people are going to vote for her anyway. But this is where we're at. I'll find out more as far as what transpires tomorrow. I'll talk about it on my next show. Maybe I'll post some stuff on Facebook or on YouTube, so people can be more aware of it. But it's getting interesting. It's not getting. I'm not worried. I'm not in the least. And in fact, I only wish I could be in Long Island tomorrow to be a part of this thing, because I love making noise. It's kind of what I do. It's why I support these stations with my program, and I hope that you do the same thing. I want to tell people again, support WBI and WPFW, and support this program. I am John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. Yahweh.